Hi everyone, it's Yvette Blowitz from SPAITGIRL.com and welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm super excited to be here with you today, and our very special guest is Maggie Hamilton. Maggie Hamilton has written over a dozen books which have been published in Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, France, Portugal, Italy, UK, US, the Arab states, South Korea, China, Lithuania, and Brazil. Maggie Hamilton is a researcher, a storyteller, and many of you might know Maggie from being on the Spirit Girl podcast show when we talked about her previous book, When We Become Strangers. We're here today to talk to Maggie Hamilton about her brand new book, What Happens to Our Kids When We Fail to Grow Up. This book is published by Affirm Press. Maggie Hamilton, welcome to the Spirit Girl podcast show. How are you today?
I'm great, and it's wonderful to be back with you, Yvette.
It's so good to have you back on the show. I loved our last conversation, and I'd love to welcome all of our global audience, listeners. So grateful you're here. So Maggie, before we dive into your book, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I grew up for the first few years in the north of England, and then we came to live in New Zealand. So then I had my teen and uni life there. Then I fell in love with my now husband, and I went back to live in London and ended up in Sydney for a couple of years. Some decades later, we're still here. I've spent most of my working life in book publishing, and words and ideas and possibilities are things that I'm utterly passionate about. When I'm not working and writing and researching, what I love to do is to get off the beaten track and learn about more cultures, more ways that we can be in the world. And I think the further off the beaten track you go, the more learning there is there for us. And that, I think, helps create a life that gives you a lot of tools to live more in a more empowered way and hopefully a more meaningful way. And I'm a bit like a magpie, I have to be honest, Yvette. What I do is I go off and I collect up all the things I learn, whether it's with my research or on my travels. And then my great passion is to share what I've learned with others, because I just love that. I think there's something really wonderful to be able to share the riches you've learned from others. So that's basically my life and what I love. And I have a real profound love of nature as well, even though I live in the city. And one of my other great passions is to actually help people have a deep relationship with nature, even though they do live in cities, and that they too can have mystical relationships with nature in the city that inspire and help us become wiser, more further seeing than we would do in everyday life without those things.
Well, Maggie, I was only saying to my mum the other evening that you are by far one of the most incredible researchers I've ever discovered when it comes to researching books.
Oh.
I'm yet to see any book that has been referenced and researched as much as you do. And I love the level of effort you go into when it goes to research and referencing, because sometimes I might read a book where they'll go, oh, this was in the research, but it doesn't say what research from or where, and you go into so much detail. It's incredible. You obviously love what you do.
I do love what I do, and I love taking things that might be quite complex, because we're all very busy, making them very easy to read and easy to understand. I love that translation process because I'm very aware we've all got a lot on, and to be able to give somebody a nugget of insight in 3 sentences that are really easy to understand, I love, because that way people are more likely to use those take-homes in their everyday life, which is what I'm passionate about. I love the grassroots. I love the fact that we can often make profound changes in our lives just through tiny little changes in our habits.
When it comes to your brand new book, What Happens to Our Kids When We Fail to Grow Up, can you tell us a little bit about the meaning behind the book title?
I mean, this might sound like a slightly scary title, but It's not at all. It's really about how we take care of the present as adults so that we can step into tomorrow in a way that is more empowered, and in so doing that we can also provide really powerful stepping stones for our children, because our children are our tomorrow. But what I see around me is lots of beautiful, capable people who've become incredibly fragile for the last decade, particularly, who've kind of lost faith in themselves and in the world, and constantly looking for ways to kind of make it better, but often the ways they choose just kind of tend to create more of the same. And what I've come to is that a lot of us have kind of got stuck in an adolescent way of thinking, at that teenage way of thinking, where we feel the victim, we're easily offended when things don't happen as we like. Instead of looking for solutions, which can be quite exciting and challenging, we blame others and complain, which is a sign of powerlessness. And I see us slipping into a kind of Peter Pan mode where we just want to live in a neverland where things are always happy. But that isn't where the richness of life is to be found. And the fact of the matter is we're never, ever going to have a life that doesn't have challenges. And of course, we've had some fairly big ones in recent times with COVID and bushfires and floods and things like that. What I'm interested in doing is gently empowering us as adults to find those ways forward, those little habits we can change, and then we're able to pass them on to our kids, so that by the time we leave the planet, we feel that our kids have everything they need to stand in the headwinds of change, because there's always change. So I hope it's a book that inspires, I hope it's gentle, and I hope it gives lots and lots of little ways we can do things better and enjoy the process.
And when it comes to your research on this book, Maggie,
Yep.
out of all the research you've done for what happens to our kids when we fail to grow up, what was most profound to you?
One of the things, and it's just a tiny little observation, what I see is this kind of growing adolescent teenage way of looking at the world. One piece of research I discovered was that in 1950, after the Second World War, when there was something like, I think, 40 million people were displaced, an enormous number, that at that stage, because there'd been so much loss, that a third of the world's population was 14 and under. And that was when we started to focus on young people, because for the older people, the baby boomers who came after the war, they invested all their hope in a better future that they had never had. They'd had 2 wars and depression. And so they wanted to create a better world. And they did this by focusing on the children. But what I've seen with my research that has happened with that, we've turned that into kind of not wanting to grow up, being fearful of aging. And so something that started off as very hopeful and positive has kind of taken a bit of a turn that isn't necessarily helpful to us. Because if we choose to stay in that kind of adolescent mindset where life is carefree and we don't have any responsibilities, etc., what we're actually putting our hands up for is to stay forever vulnerable and forever dependent on others. And that's dependent on others to feel good, for direction, and for a whole lot of things. Whereas if we choose to push through that into a more grown-up space, then we're able to stand on our own 2 feet, and we're not afraid when life gets difficult, because we're focused on solutions. How can we make this better? How can we change it to be where we need to be? And so what we're then doing, even if it's in a very small way in our homes and communities, we're actually helping shape the future. And that's a very exciting thing.
Maggie, what could someone do if they're wanting to better equip themselves and their family for a better future?
I think one of the things is to look at what we do when we're adolescents. So to create a family, a culture where instead of allowing a lot of blaming and complaining in the family, and this is also very good in the workplace as well, of course, is for a parent to sympathise with a child. Yes, I can see that when that happened, that must have been uncomfortable, it must have been embarrassing, it might be hurtful. I wonder what we can do to make sure that doesn't happen again. So as a family, we become solutions oriented. It's not as if we don't acknowledge a child's feelings, because of course that's very important, but we don't allow them to stay in that place. So we nudge them into, how can we do it better next time? And also to start to look at feelings, so that we're actually teaching children to start to look at feelings of people around them. We've all been in lockdown, now we're out and about, and we perhaps see a neighbour, where we start to focus our kids on, how do you think Mrs. Jones was when we had a chat to her today? Did you think she looked a bit sad, or do you think she looked a bit tired? What do you think? So that we're actually starting to teach them to push out from how they feel in the world, which is the child's view. It's all about how we feel, because we haven't learned to take on other people. She's looking a bit tired. I wonder if there's something we can do to help her with that. Or we see that she looks a bit lonely, so we've made a cake because we had a few people round and there's a bit of cake left over. I wonder if we should take a plate down to Mrs. Jones, and that might give her a lift. You might encourage one of the children or a couple of the children to take it down, and then ask them how she was when we gave the cake. So what we're doing is we're encouraging our children to nudge out of that blaming and complaining, out of how I feel about it, to start to be aware of the people around us and how they are, and how we can connect in with that in a way that can be joyful, and come back and say, oh, she really loved that cake. You feel good. So there's lots of little tips like that in the book, Yvette, to really help parents push beyond their own sense of exhaustion and where to go with issues, so that we create a much more life-enhancing vibe. Because if we don't do that, what happens is then we and our kids become like Peter Pan. We just want to play all the time. We don't want to have to do any difficult stuff. If things go wrong, then we always expect others to pick up the pieces. And what happens with the Peter Pans in life is that the only way they can operate is to have Wendy's. And the Wendy's are the people who go around after the Peter Pan and his friends, and they pick up the pieces. They mend the broken bridges. And it's not satisfactory for the Peter Pans because they never grow up. And it's not satisfactory for those of us who might have slipped into being Wendy's in our families or in our workplace, because it's it never changes with the Peter Pans. They're always going to continue to create issues, and we're going to be the ones that have to pick up the pieces. So what we're doing is we're creating a situation where within our homes, our workplaces, our communities, we can nudge past that stuff that causes resentment and exhausts us to a place where we are more in charge of our destiny. We're actually excited by taking part in better ways forward.
Wow, that was so incredible, Maggie. They were amazing tips. And like you said, your book is full of them. Maggie, you live in the city. Do you find still to this day, if you'd walk down the street, that people are still with their head down, they don't really want to acknowledge someone else because it's nearly like they're afraid of what might happen? They sort of want to keep their privacy, they're shut off. But we know that head down, not looking at anyone, isn't really creating a thriving community.
No.
What are your thoughts on this, Maggie? I mean, you've done a lot of research in this area, so just curious. My biggest tip would be to every parent who's tuning in, or carer or child, put your head up, say good morning or a smile or an acknowledgement. As my mum says, it costs nothing to be polite or to be kind. Can you imagine a street, say Sydney City, if people actually went, morning, morning, hello, smile. It would be the biggest social experiment I'd love to do, even if it was for an hour.
And you're absolutely right of it, because we're actually wired to connect. And that connection is a very profound thing. It might seem like a simple thing, but it's that thing of being seen and heard. And we all need that. And I think the problem with social media is it has many wonderful possibilities. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this without it. But I think what it has done is it has taken the place of a really genuine connection. And I must say, I live in an apartment where there's quite a few apartments in inner city Sydney, and we actually have that vibe. We have it in our suburb, and I reckon it's because it's a suburb with very different people in it. It is a suburb known for a wide range of different people, and I think the people who come to live here, not that it's perfect, it has its issues like everywhere else, but it's actually a suburb where people love difference and are comfortable with the fact that people can be very different from us. And it creates a lot of happiness. And I think one of the conceptions of our time is that we're most happy if we're just around people like us. Well, I think that's a recipe for boredom and depression. And I don't want to live around people just like me. I want to live around people who can show me different ways to be in the world, whose stories are very different from mine, whose stories can touch my heart, can make my heart sing, can teach me about things in life, about courage and all sorts of aspects of life that I personally have not experienced. And I think we've become afraid of difference, when in fact we need to gently embrace it. Nobody's asking you to go up and hug everybody, but and that's why people who have dogs say it's so brilliant, because it breaks the ice and people stop and talk to each other about the dogs.
Yes.
And I've just been in the UK to see the family, and I'd forgotten how nutty the UK is about dogs. I mean, I've witnessed complete strangers throwing themselves at somebody else's dog as if it was their own, and all this sort of stuff. But I can see the value in that, because suddenly people are talking really intensely about this furry creature that they both are passionate about. And it is about passion. And I would encourage people to start with the elderly, because the elderly are the most forgotten, ignored members of our community. And even if you might not feel it's cool to talk to somebody your age, just worried they think you're weird. I mean, who cares really? Just in case you are worried about that, talk to an elderly person. Say good morning. Talk about the weather. Isn't it a beautiful day today? Smile at them and move on. And they are the people who most need to be seen and heard in our communities. So give them a lift. Make their day by seeing them and allowing them to know that you have seen them.
Oh, I love that. You were so right with the elderly. And this morning I went for my walk and I've met this beautiful lady, Cecily. I don't know if she's in her 80s or 90s, but she's doing really extremely well. She goes for a walk every morning from the aged care across quite a busy road. She walks quite a way, and she also does some exercises. I love stopping to chat to her, and she really values coming out and seeing different people and meeting different people. And she did mention she even finds dogs are like her friends. She loves seeing the dogs, and people stop. And people just stop and have a chat to her. And it's really heartwarming to see. And you find out so much about history. So I think that's what I love so much. She was sharing stories of, particularly up in a place in Ingham, where when they all came back from the war, the government gave them all farms to go on, but the allotments were probably too small and unviable for farming. They all went broke. Just fascinating stories like that. And her words of wisdom, I'm afraid of stopping walking, because if I do, it might mean can't get out of bed. So one of the things we can all do, one of your greatest tips there, Maggie Hamilton, is just stop and smile at an elderly or say hello. And I think if we just do that alone, that'll help build that community connection. And
Yeah.
you're right about the dogs, though. There's another elderly lady I've met who's got a poodle, and we had a poodle growing up, and we've made that connection through her dog. But her husband had passed away, so her son had bought her a dog, but she's made so many friends and connections just from the dog. Dogs are wonderful reminders of how they just see another dog and they're happy and they all want to socialize and get together. And you can see how dogs are so important in our community. Talking about what's happening over in the UK, I see this every time I go for a walk. The dogs all playing and getting together. If anyone's living on their own, get yourself a dog. It's just a wonderful way to connect. Now, Maggie, when did you get time to write this book? Because your last book, which we did a podcast show, must have been about a year ago now, when we talked about when we become strangers.
Yeah. Well, actually, When We Become Strangers, because of COVID, was delayed it was 18 months from the time I delivered it till it got published. So both books took about 2 years. But of course, because the first one was delayed, and then my publisher was very keen to publish this one in this half of the year. While it might have seemed that I just did it in a jiffy, there were both 2 years solid work there, but very enjoyable, because most of what I talk about in all my books, all research, I would say that 90% of it I don't know about before I begin. So for me, it's a huge journey of discovery too. It's not as if I know all this stuff. It's just that I want answers. And then I'm so excited with the answers. I just have to write them up and share them with everybody in my books.
And you obviously love community, because your books are very driven around how we can have a socially connected community, a supportive community.
Yes.
And instead of being in silos and this individual, it's just our family and no one else, and head down, no connection going on. You're so passionate about community.
I am. And it's the way I lead my life, because I know it's what makes me thrive. And in fact, it was rather lovely, because I was in the UK because a very precious aunt had died. And I was only there for a very short time, but I'd already started to form a little community there in the street while I was there. And I was so touched that some of the neighbours came to say goodbye to me, even though I was there to support my cousin. And my husband teases me. He doesn't think I've ever met a stranger. But I love people. I love life. And sometimes we're afraid to let others in. It doesn't mean to say we have to be living with others 24/7, but it does mean that when we are with others, even if it's just saying hello on the street, that we actually are there 100% in that Buddhist mindfulness of actually really being with that person. So for that minute or however long we have with them, they feel we are actually there with them and not somewhere else in our heads or on our phones or whatever. So to me, it's the greatest joy, because I know just how much it feeds my soul. And I want others to have that same level of soul food, to be honest, Yvette.
I'm so sorry to hear about your auntie passing. I mean, that must have been very difficult.
Yeah, it's sad. I think she'd led a wonderful life. She'd had a lot of challenges, but she created love everywhere she went. And that was very satisfying. It was a good life. And I think while there's sadness there, you're left with gratitude that you were able to be part of that love, to be able to be part of that big heart. That's a blessing, I think.
Yeah, and it's so lovely that visitors came to see you before you left, and that really made it special, them coming to see you off. In our little complex, one of my beautiful neighbours, her sister came to visit from Korea. And then when her sister left, she bought me this little plant, which I still have, this plastic little plant, but with a card which says, "Thank you so much for making me feel welcomed, and thanks for your big smile and asking how I was, and you made me to feel very welcomed." And I think it's those little moments that you don't even realize how much a "how are you, good morning" smile
exactly
can make someone feel welcomed.
And I think that's when the world becomes a more intimate space for us. There's a person from a completely different culture feeling that you have welcomed her here on a visit. We're often complex when you go to another country and you're visiting. Lots of things you enjoy, but there's times when you just want to be back home. And that's when other people's kindness, when that kicks in, it just warms your space and on you go. So well done you, Yvette.
Thank you, Maggie. Well, I've read a lot of your books, so I'm sure that was some tips from there. I want to ask you, you do a lot of your writing in pens.
Write longhand first. People are quite shocked today, but I find that my writing is better if I write longhand. I have more attention and I actually retain more. I do love writing. To me, it's like a meditation. And I also teach people because in publishing, I've been a publisher as well as a writer. So I kind of know what it's like to wear both hats. So for me, it's just as much joy as to write, as to teach others how to polish their work, because it is such a wonderful passion to have and to share your passion. I mean, what could be better?
That's interesting because I love to handwrite. I literally, as a writer, I've got to write old school style in a book. I don't know what it is, but it just feels right. I just got to journal it, write it. And then later on, if I'm going to sort of put it together, I'll sit in front of the computer and try and structure it.
I find that makes my writing much more real, and perhaps it is for you in doing that. And I think we all have our rituals that help us get in the zone as well. And so I suspect that's the other thing for you. By journaling it, it's getting in the zone for you.
What are some of your self-care rituals that you love to do?
Well, I'm a meditator. I've been meditating for a few decades, and I'd rather meditate than have extra sleep. And although I love being around people and like all of us have a busy life, I do also love silence and I do love my own space. So that's very important for me. If I'm in the car, for instance, I tend to not have anything on. So I do try to balance out the day in terms of connecting with others. And even if it's just small periods of time to have that silence, that's really important to me because I find I recharge. I find it helps me make connections between things. It helps my creativity. I love being in nature. If I'm upset or tired, I don't tend to talk to friends or Derek about it unless it's something really major. I will go into nature, and I have parks near here, even though I'm in the city, Sydney, and I will have time with the trees and the plants, and that just totally fills me up. And I love dance. I do belly dancing, not very well, but I love dance. I love travel to out of way places when I can do that. And I do love people. I'm endlessly fascinated. And I think you put that together and that feeds my soul.
Love that. And I love that you're trying to interweave that now into our families, community, our children, where it takes me back to probably when I grew up as a kid in the 70s or the 80s in Australia, where it was just the norm. We all said, good morning, how are you? We really were fascinated with the person that lived down the road. Love how you're bringing these books out that can actually help parents of today who are busier than ever, have so much on their plate, and really raising kids in a tech world where, from all the interviews I've recently done over the pandemic, the science is all showing that children shouldn't be on adult social media apps.
No.
At minimum age 13, 12 at best. I think if that was put into place right across the world, that would also help with developing those communication skills and interpersonal skills in community. Now, Maggie, I could talk to you forever about your books and writing, and we could have an absolute marathon show. With your book now, what is your hope for your newfound book readers?
I just hope that, I think there's a lot of fear about the future a lot of anxiety from parents about how their children will navigate this world of climate change and changing borders and a lot of things that we're dealing with right now. And my hope is that this will really give parents a sense of empowerment and courage and strength to do the difficult things themselves, which is the adult thing to do, and to push through that so that those things that perhaps are intimidating for them become easy, and it enables them to be strong around things that they might feel wobbly around at the moment. And in so doing, they're then able to create beautiful stepping stones to show the kids the way forward so that our children can stand on our shoulders and can meet the headwinds of change that are happening on the planet with strength, with compassion, with wisdom, and with a sense of excitement that they're going to come up with solutions that we can't dream of. And that's very exciting. But we can only do that if we're standing on a solid ground ourselves. So what I hope I'm creating for parents is a loving, solid space for them to stand strong and be who they came here to be.
Oh, I love that hope, Maggie Hamilton. That's such a beautiful hope. And how can we stay in touch with you after this podcast show?
Well, probably the best way is through my website, which is maggiehamilton.org, and there's an opportunity to get in touch with me there. And I always love to hear from people, and I'm also on LinkedIn as well if people want to look there. I love connecting with people and hearing about wonderful things they're doing. So please feel free to do that, because it's only through sharing ideas and possibilities that we move forward in life.
Congratulations again, Maggie Hamilton, on the launch of your book. It's out now on booktopia.com.au. I saw it in Big W today in the parenting section. And I did a little video of that from a TikTok account at Yvette, Blowitz and SPAITGIRL. I mean, it must be so joyful when you see people pick up your book and read it and learn from it, and all of that research and those tips are going to good use.
I do love it. And it's about sharing story and ideas and possibilities and things that hopefully will make the toes curl.
Thank you so much, Maggie Hamilton. I could talk to you forever. It's just lovely to see your brand new book out, and I just can't wait for our audience to be able to grab a copy of your latest book or any of your books, which can be of great help and benefit, especially while we're trying to navigate our way through this world, which is quite different from when I grew up in the 70s and the 80s.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we need all those tips you have in those books, Maggie, and all that research you've done for us. Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you, Yvette, and go well to you and all your listeners, darling.
Thank you so much for listening into this week's Feel Good From Within with Yvette Blowitz SPAITGIRL podcast episode. I truly hope you found this conversation to be of interest and benefit to you. In support, I would love if you would subscribe to the SPAITGIRL podcast show on any app you're listening to this show through, or on YouTube too. As a little random act of kindness, feel free to leave a 5-star rating and review of what you love most from this conversation too. Be sure to share this show with your family, friends, and community. Also, subscribe to my mailing list at SPAITGIRL.com. Follow SPAITGIRL or Yvette Blowitz on any social media app. And together, let's feel good from within.